The legislature, counties, cities, towns, school districts, and public corporations shall not make any direct or indirect appropriation or payment from any public fund or monies or any grant of lands or other property for any sectarian purpose or to aid in any church, school, academy, seminary, college, university, or other literary or scientific institution controlled in whole or in part by any church, sect, or denomination. This section shall not apply to funds from federal sources provided to the state for the express purpose of distribution to non-public education. Montana Constitution, Article 10, Subsection 6. Now, some of you might be wondering, why would I read a section of the Montana Constitution in what is supposedly a focus on the family video? But if you follow my Twitter, you will know that something came up this week on Wednesday. And I couldn't sit back. I had to make a video on this. So, unfortunately, if you were looking forward to the Focus on the Family propaganda video, that's being moved to next week. But I hope you stay tuned for this little ride we're going on. And special thanks to Jay from In the Conspiracy or ETC for what you're about to see next. So, despite my New Year's resolution to not put things on the back burner for too long, I was compelled by some legal news to make this video. Because on Wednesday, the Supreme Court started hearing a case. And no, this is not about the impeachment. And yes, this is about politics, but this case will have serious ramifications for the future of separation of church and state in the United States. The Supreme Court started hearing the case Espinoza versus the Montana Department of Revenue. And due to the background surrounding this case and the importance of this case, I could not stay quiet about it. I cannot, with my background, I have to address this. And you'll see why. So, in 2015, the Montana legislature passed a bill which gave people who donated money to scholarship programs for private schools a tax write-off on a dollar-for-dollar basis up to a maximum amount of $150. Now, most private schools in Montana are religious. And Montana has a Blaine Amendment, which I read in the intro of this video. It's essentially the state cannot directly or indirectly finance religious schooling as per the Constitution. So the Montana Supreme Court struck down the law. Now, and Espinoza and some other parents who actually from western Montana appealed, and it has reached the Supreme Court. And people are hoping that this will rule, the Blaine Amendment in the Montana Constitution and all the other Blaine Amendments as unconstitutional. So, what, you may ask, is a Blaine Amendment? Well, in the late 1800s, late 19th century, a representative from Maine, Representative Blaine, introduced an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to add to the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law, establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The proposed amendment was to add that, was to prohibit funding for religion, to prohibit government funding from going to religious institutions. It blew through the House of Representatives, with a vote of 88 for and 7 against. However, when it reached the Senate, it barely missed the supermajority that it needed to pass as an amendment to the Constitution. However, due to the immense support, and kind of important to mention this now, it was likely introduced and highly supported because of anti-Catholic sentiment at the time. But due to this heavy support, the Congress made a law that said any state that seeks to join the Union as a state has to have a provision in their constitution, in their state constitution, that no state funds will go to religious schools. So, Montana and 30 other U.S. states have these Blaine Amendments. Now, the side arguing for Espinoza alleges that because it was written during a period of anti-Catholic sentiment, or rather, it arose from anti-Catholic sentiment, that these Blaine Amendment, that specifically the one being tried is Montana's. But if the Supreme Court decides to side with Espinoza, all Blaine Amendments would essentially be deemed unconstitutional. So, one of the arguments for this, for Espinoza's side is that since it was written from a discriminatory standpoint, it is automatically unconstitutional because of citing precedent from civil rights cases, essentially. Second, they say that striking down the tax write-off, the scholarship program, was discriminatory in nature and therefore violated the 14th Amendment by not giving equal access. And the third one, the third main argument for Espinoza's side cites a previous Supreme Court case, Trinity Lutheran, which the Trinity Lutheran decision states that religious institutions can receive state funding if it's not directed in a religious manner, if it's neutral. Like, for instance, fixing up a parking lot, or, if that parking lot is open to the public, or refurbishing a playground if the playground is open to neighborhood kids. Now, what may seem to be the strongest of the arguments is the whole anti-Catholic discrimination, because it was written in a time where the Catholic Church was setting up its own network of schools in the U.S. and was trying to get state funding for it. But Montana's Constitution was given an overhaul in 1972. And when it was given an overhaul, they didn't just rubber stamp this Blaine Amendment. They debated it. And they decided to keep it because it kept the state from showing favoritism to one sect or another. And in fact, that's when subsection 2, the bit about federal money, was actually added to that amendment. So, that decision largely falls on its face, and the Trinity Lutheran decision is arguably inapplicable, because the Trinity Lutheran decision specifically cites neutral purposes, while religious schools largely serve to indoctrinate children into their faith. Now, I am a Montana citizen, and I spent 6 years of my life in a fundamentalist Christian school. So, that's why I feel like I need to speak on this issue. Now, the side for the Montana Department of Revenue argue, and actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg pointed out that since the Montana Supreme Court just struck the program entirely, they were no longer being discriminated against, and so the 14th Amendment argument didn't really apply. And along with that, the way I see it, in the U.S., churches are tax exempt anyways, and honestly, I don't agree with that. Also, during my research for this video, because I did fall into a bit of a research rabbit hole, I learned what specific school Espinoza was sending their children to. And turns out that Stillwater Christian School has in fact a variable tuition program. They do state that it only reduces tuition by half, but still, it still has that program. Also, sure you can't get a write-off for, donating to a specific scholarship fund. However, since churches are tax exempt and are 501c3s, you can get a tax write-off for donating to the church. And I'm pretty sure you can put strings on that donation to the church that runs the school and say, hey, this is for, this is for scholarships for kids who need it. Arguably, I personally view most religious, most church-run schools as indoctrination mills. That are more focused on indoctrinating children as opposed to educating them. And looking into Stillwater Christian School, it seems that school in particular definitely falls more on the indoctrination line, and we will get into that. But, and personally, I don't have any problem with, with a religious school, presuming, I'm fine with a little sprinkling of religion in the school. I mean, I get it, it's run by a church, as long as it's kept in the background, as long as it's not forced on the children, as long as the curriculum keeps to academic and scientific standards. As long as they teach actual science, as long as they teach actual history, as long as they are educating the children instead of indoctrinating them. So, I pulled up the Stillwater Christian School website, and I found some things in their About Us section that concerned me, and we're going to go over them. Going over the most concerning bullet points in their commitments and statement of faith section, and a very, very disconcerting disclaimer that's at the bottom of their website. So, we'll start with the bullet points from their commitments section. So, Stillwater Christian School is committed to a classical approach to teaching and learning which equips students to think, write, and speak clearly. No problem with that. It's a good thing to teach children to think critically. It's a good thing to teach children to write well, to really learn how to communicate their ideas, to communicate what they found, to communicate their opinions. And, yeah, write and speak clearly. But here's the rest of that bullet point. And to be thoroughly grounded with a biblical worldview. Now, having a biblical worldview in and of itself isn't necessarily bad depending on how you interpret the Bible. Which is what we'll get to when we get to their statement of faith. However, that being said, thoroughly grounded with a biblical worldview is very much, from what I can see, a red flag saying we're here to indoctrinate your kids. It's not right out there in the open. I will say that it's not explicitly put there, and you can go ahead and disagree with me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I do get an implicit sense that that's the purpose there. Next bullet point. Developing Christian character for life through instruction in relationships, in work habits, and decision-making. Developing Christian character for life. Once again, especially combined with that previous bullet point, very much a red flag for indoctrination, in my opinion. And I will say that everything that I've read in preparation for this video will be linked in the description below. And especially this page. So, last bullet point, and there are commitments before we move on to the real meat of the issue, the statement of faith and the disclaimer at the end. Honoring family and church as God-ordained institutions and to teaching values that reinforce families' efforts to raise their children biblically. All those bullet points put together scream at me that we're here to indoctrinate your children in a specific mindset. That being said, it's definitely what I found in their statement of faith that really concerns me, because, in the statement of faith is where they define what they see as a biblical mindset. And hoo boy. Now, before I continue on to the statement of faith, I will say that this is not their statement of faith in completion. This is the more yikesy. This is the yikesy bits that I found while I was reading through it. And I will say that there is a bullet point that I did cut off, that I did omit the end of for the purpose of emphasis. But once again, if you want to read it through yourself, it will be in the description below. And so go ahead and read it. If you feel like I'm misrepresenting it, click the link in the description below. It is their statement of faith on their website. And if I'm misreading it, feel free to discuss that with me in the comments. Without further ado, we believe the Bible to be the verbal, plenary, divinely inspired, authoritative, and inerrant Word of God, our sole authority. So that tells me that there's a definite fundamentalist leaning to this institution. We believe in the spiritual unity of all believers in our Lord Jesus Christ. That was largely just caught up in the grab. The church is the body of Christ. That's a doctrinal thing. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. We believe the creation of the universe and human beings was a unique, designed act of God, and that man and woman were made in the image and likeness of God. So, this tells me that they're creationist, which means they probably won't be teaching proper science, at least in evolutionary terms. And I suspect that this school may have young Earth leanings. It's largely off how this specific bullet is phrased. I don't see anything explicit in their statement of faith, and I didn't get a look at their curriculum. And it doesn't look like they're running the ACE curriculum, which I learned under. So I could very well be wrong about young Earth. But I'm getting a young Earth vibe. But that could easily just be me. So now we get into some real chunky bits. So we believe that God wonderfully and immutably, I'll repeat this, wonderfully and immutably creates each person as male or female, and that these two distinct complementary sexes together reflect the image and nature of God. So, they do not support the existence of trans people. They do not believe in the existence of trans people. They do not believe in the existence of non-binary people. And seems to me that they're very much traditionalist. It may very well lean to a traditionalist interpretation of gender roles. I may be reading a bit too much into that for that specific bit. But we've got a couple more to go through, and then the disclaimer. The disclaimer that's at the bottom of every page of their website that I've seen. That's going to be fun. So, anyways, next bullet point. We believe that God created marriage to be exclusively the union of one man and one woman, and that intimate sexual activity is to occur exclusively within that union. Now, of course, I could have lumped those two bullets together and just say they're anti-LGBT. However, that last bit also tells me that they're abstinence only. So that means that kids going to this school will not get a proper proper health education in regards to sexual health. They will be given abstinence only education, which has been proven to not work. They will get, if you do the dirty before you're married, then you're going to hell. Presumably. Or at least God will be upset, God will be upset with you. And it may very well extend to, self-care, shall we say. So, and I did cut off the end of this last bullet that I'm about to read, once again for emphasis, and you can click the link in the description below. It will be, labeled as the About page, to actually read and, to read, the statement of faith and the commitment section for yourself to see if I'm misrepresenting this. But once again, I cut it off where I did for emphasis only. We believe that all human life is sacred and created by God in His image. Human life is of inestimable worth in all of its dimensions, including pre-born babies. So, it's anti-abortion. It's a pro-life school. The rest of this bullet point just mentions people with disabilities and up until death. So they're also against assisted suicide. But I did, like I said, that bit at the beginning seemed to be the more important bit. It seemed to be the bit that it'd be best emphasized. And now we come to the disclaimer. Hoo boy, the disclaimer. Now, the disclaimer isn't actually terrible in what it actually says. It's what it leaves out. That's the issue here. So, let's take a look at that. So, this is the disclaimer that's on the bottom of every page on their website that I've seen, or that I've scrolled all the way to the bottom of. Stillwater Christian School admits students of any race, sex, disability, color, national and ethnic origin to all the rights, privileges, programs, and activities generally accorded or made available to students at the school. It does not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, disability, color, national and ethnic origin in administration of its educational policies, admissions policies, scholarship and loan programs, and athletic and other school-administered programs. Does anyone see the glaring omissions that are the problem here? I'll give you a second to let it sink in. From what I noticed, there are two federally protected classes of people that are woefully omitted in this disclaimer. Sexual orientation. Possibly three. Not sure on the case of gender identity, how well gender identity is protected by law. So, sexual orientation, gender identity, and religion. So, seems to me by omitting those three that legal disclaimer is essentially saying that they reserve the right to discriminate on those bases. Now, is an institution like this something that we want something that we want the state to fund, even through a tax credit program? I, for one, say no. The only upside of this, the only thing I can say that I can say about this Christian school right here, that is that the one I went through was most likely worse because I've seen the pictures on the website, and there are some pictures of, kids with their school books, and it looks to me like that school is not running the ACE the ACE curriculum. So that is the only prop that I can give this school. What seems to me to be at least a low-grade attempt at indoctrinating children. And before I continue with this, I will say, be sure, do me a favor, like, share, subscribe. No, definitely share this out. Like, I know that the case is already being heard in the Supreme Court, and it won't be decided until summer. But the word should go out about this. The word should go out about the threat that, separation of church and state is very much potentially under. Because if the Blaine amendments are found to be unconstitutional, then we will see things like this being funded. And we know how politics in America works. We know that Christianity, and specifically evangelical Protestantism, will be favored over everything else. Except in Utah. We may very well see the state funding indoctrination mills. And as we all know, as I have ended all of my videos since like my second or third one, we all know, and you really need to remember that indoctrination is a hell of a drug. We don't need indoctrination. We don't need no thought control. No dark sarcasm in the classroom. Preachers, leave our schools alone.